This is Popular Front, a podcast focused on the niche details of modern warfare and underreported conflict with me, Jake Hanrahan. Today we're speaking to writer, researcher James Barnett. He's going to be talking to us about the ongoing battles in the Niger Delta in the south of Nigeria. It's a very oil-rich region. There has been piracy, militant groups fighting big companies like Shell Oil, cults, underground oil refinery, all sorts of stuff happening in that region. Now the various militant groups are not fighting the oil companies, but are actually often fighting each other, vying for power of the oil there in the region. If you like what we're doing here at Popular Front, support us at patreon.com/popularfront. I think before we go into the full details of the various militant groups, the various companies that are trying to move into the space, let's actually get into what the Niger Delta is, because I think a lot of people are not fully informed on it. It's quite a niche topic in some ways, in other ways it's not. But yeah, let's go into what is the Niger Delta and why is it so coveted?
So, Nigeria is traditionally, right, it's one of like either the top 10 or top 15 oil producing nations in the world. And also within Africa, it's the biggest, most populous country, typically the largest economy on the continent. So Nigeria kind of often has this reputation of being in some ways like the giant of Africa, right? This big country with a lot of potential and stuff. And really, since the 1970s, for those who might be aware of kind of the Arab-Israeli war, and you had this big oil embargo imposed by OPEC, which had the result of kind of shooting up the price of Brent crude globally. So as a result, oil-producing nations from kind of the 1970s onwards really hit a boom period, and Nigeria was one of those. And so as a result, Nigeria's economy has, to a large extent, but especially I'd say through like the 70s to the early 2000s, has been heavily reliant on oil exports. Nigeria doesn't actually even have, at present, it doesn't even have any functioning refineries. So it's not even really producing, or it's not refining the oil that it's producing. So it's not as much even for domestic consumption, because Nigeria is actually importing refined oil. But really, like the economy, it's like a massive share of the budget, most of the foreign exchange reserves of the country, all of that stuff. In many ways, like the economic lifeblood of the country is producing crude oil to be exported onto the global market. So the thing is, though, Nigeria is a big country, right? It's presently divided administratively into 6 geopolitical zones, and those being like the Northwest, North Central, Northeast, and then similar Southwest, South, and Southeast. So the oil in Nigeria is actually really all concentrated in one region. That's the Niger Delta region, what's today often referred to as the South-South. And the South-South is an interesting region because it kind of lies between two of the areas that are traditionally seen as like kind of the two of the politically hegemonic or major blocks. Right, Nigerian politics, going back to the era of British colonialism, has often been seen as kind of like a balancing act between, the people of the West, which is the Yoruba ethnic group, the people of the North, which is the House of Fulani, and then the people in the East, which is the Igbo people. But to a large extent, the oil in Nigeria is located in the Niger Delta, which is an area inhabited by ethnic minorities. So they're not part of any of those kind of big three ethnic groups. And so as a result, there's kind of this sense within the Delta that they're excluded politically from the countries, from national politics and all of that. So you have this kind of weird combination wherein the wealth of the nation, in many ways, the lifeblood of the nation, the thing that kind of keeps the government running to the extent that the Nigerian government functions, is all, it's a commodity that's being extracted from a territory that's inhabited by these smaller ethnic groups that are minorities. And so that's obviously going to kind of create some sense of injustice or a feeling that things are off balance and stuff. And so really since the era of independence, since the 1960s, there have been kind of repeated movements throughout from local people in the Delta calling for either a form of independence or more commonly like a greater distribution of oil revenues and oil wealth to the Niger Delta areas. Because especially in the era of military rule from the 60s to the 90s, Nigeria established a very centralized state wherein all of the oil that's getting produced in the Niger Delta, that those revenues are going to the federal government in Abuja. And then for the most part, this kind of started to change in the 1990s, but for much of Nigeria's history, the federal government was giving very little of those revenues back to the states that are actually producing the oil, right? So that kind of creates the groundwork for the sense of grievances. Things started to get much more aggravated, I'd say, in the 1980s for a couple of reasons. You had kind of more youth groups and stuff in the region mobilizing, so you had a whole new element of youth politics and stuff. But then you also had this added dimension of kind of the increased number of oil spills and ecological damage from oil production that was a result of the kind of the shoddy management or the neglect from the international oil companies, particularly Shell being kind of the big giant in the region. So it's not like purely a local story either. It's the grievances were against the Nigerian government, but they were also against the international oil companies, which were seen as kind of being in cahoots with the government. And so there was this sense that, the people of the Delta felt that they were getting kind of the worst part of the deal, right? They were getting all the environmental damage and kind of seeing none of the benefits, the revenues and stuff of oil production. So in the 1990s, protests started to really kind of spike up. And at that point, Nigeria was still ruled by these kind of military juntas and stuff. And so you had a number of kind of prominent activists. The most famous one is this poet, Ken Saro-Wiwa. And he and 8 others in 1995 were executed by the military regime of General Sani Abacha, which a lot of people kind of see nowadays as something of a turning point, because it turned these kind of environmental activists into martyrs and stuff. And it also, I think, showed a lot of people in the Delta that, the Nigerian military or the Nigerian state was not really interested in compromise or negotiation, that they were, taking a heavy-handed approach to this. And so the response, the kind of reaction had to be of equal measure. So starting in the 1990s, you had more kind of like violent actions from loosely organized youth groups and stuff, groups that are often referred to colloquially in Nigeria as cults. We would probably better describe them as like criminal gangs. A lot of them actually were formed at university kind of as like university fraternities, but then they turned into kind of organized crime outfits. That's maybe like a topic for a whole nother discussion, because they're a fascinating subsection of kind of the criminal underworld in Nigeria. So groups like cults, groups like, youth movements and stuff started taking more kind of violent measures to disrupt the production of oil in the region. So that would include like sabotaging pipelines. It would include occupying flow stations. So, forcefully taking over these areas and stuff to kind of force the oil companies to come out and negotiate and meet the demands of the local communities. So all this stuff was kind of escalating through the 90s and early 2000s. But it wasn't happening under kind of a single umbrella. It was lots of disparate groups kind of acting independently and stuff out of kind of, genuine grievance, although to some extent, and maybe we can talk about this later because it's quite complicated, but there's always been an element, I think, as well, of kind of competition between local elites and a degree of opportunism, I would say, with kind of the different certain like political entrepreneurs or kind of community leaders taking opportunities to kind of use the grievances of the people against the oil companies to kind of enrich themselves or position themselves as kind of these like militant brokers and stuff. So, I mean, to get back just kind of very quickly to wrap up the general overview of the general trajectory of the conflict, excuse me, you have, throughout the 2000s, the violence really escalates. I think kind of the peak period would be like end of 2005 into 2006, 2007, when you have the militants, even though they're still kind of operating as, different outfits, they've kind of come together under this umbrella organization, the Movement for the Emancipation of the Niger Delta, known by its acronym MEND, which kind of at the very least was like a way of kind of, it was like a public-facing umbrella group, kind of almost like you had in Syria, the different kind of operations rooms or whatever, kind of a way to express the grievances and their objectives collectively and stuff. But at the core, what it was a group of kind of disparate militant elements, kind of targeting the Nigerian state, both in terms of like attacking Nigerian soldiers and police, and in some instances attacking government officials and stuff, but also very much targeting the oil infrastructure of the state, that being their primary focus. So in that period of like the mid 2000s, the Niger Delta insurgency was kind of at its highest, at its peak. And it really seemed for a time, some Nigerian and international commentators were kind of treating this as like an existential threat for Nigeria, right? Because the Nigerian state, since essentially 1970, has just been reliant on crude oil exports. And in the mid 2000s, these militants were sending Nigeria's crude numbers tanking. Because they were blowing up pipelines, they were attacking offshore facilities, they had sophisticated weapons, they were operating in these kind of high-powered speedboats and stuff. They were kidnapping a lot of oil workers, including a lot of foreign workers. So that was causing a lot of issues for the oil companies as well. They were having trouble even like maintaining their stations and stuff just because of the security risks of sending staff out there and such. And so, essentially the Nigerian state, after kind of several years of trying to combat this threat militarily, but failing in that effort, the Nigerian state in 2009 essentially offered the militants a broad-based amnesty called the Presidential Amnesty Program. And kind of in tandem with that, with the amnesty, which promised, that if the militants laid down their weapons, they'd receive stuff like job training, they'd receive, opportunities to kind of work in the oil industry and stuff. And kind of a big component of that not technically part of the amnesty, but that was happening concurrently, was this effort to essentially to start giving out security contracts to the militants. So essentially, the militants went from blowing up the pipelines to being paid to protect those same pipelines. And so since 2009, that's kind of the period we've been in, where, nominally there's no insurgency in the Niger Delta, and Nigerians will speak broadly of kind of ex-militants. So these big figures down there, they'll say like, oh, they're ex-militants, as in, to suggest that they're not currently involved in militancy. They've taken an amnesty, they work with the government and all that stuff. But as anyone from the Delta can tell you, and what you found, what you find, and what I found when I went to the region, is that there's still a lot of criminal violence happening. There's kind of a lot of jockeying for influence between these different outfits, these different militant groups and criminal groups and stuff that are involved in. They're involved in different trades, including the oil bunkering. So that's like siphoning oil directly from the pipelines, refining artisanal oil and stuff, artisanally refining oil from the pipelines to turn it into diesel or other products that they can sell in the black market. And then, stuff like kidnapping for ransom, high seas piracy. So today, the Niger Delta is still very much kind of a hotbed of criminal violence and insecurity, but it's got these added dimensions of there's a lot of kind of alternating cooperation and clashing between different militants in the states. So it's quite a complex environment. And yeah, I hope that provides a kind of general overview.
Definitely. I'm imagining the oil contracts given to the various militant groups were not given out equally, which is probably a part of the tension.
Yeah, definitely. Definitely. And so, and you've kind of seen that, like, some of these big, the hierarchies of these different militant groups are actually a whole kind of interesting subject to study on their own, because kind of like with some of these other criminal militants in Nigeria, like I've done a lot of research on these bandit warlords in the Northwest who operate somewhat similarly. But you'll often have these kind of lower level commanders that have a lot of autonomy and stuff, but they're kind of, they pay homage in the Nigerian parlance to these more like senior figures that are kind of the big names and the figureheads to some extent, the kingpins of the Niger Delta insurgency. And so you definitely have a lot of competition, both at the lower levels between some of these groups about like, who gets to be within, or some specific generals kind of umbrella. But then you also have that fighting between the generals and stuff. And sometimes it takes the form of political lobbying. We've actually seen a bunch of that recently since the new president came in, with one militant in particular who's kind of close to the president, has been, the reports are he's been lobbying for his own people to get some surveillance contracts because a rival got the lion's share of them last year. But then it can also play out violently on the ground, as you suggest.
I remember first reading about the Niger Delta Avengers, and the imagery was insane. These big, henched off, like muscly guys with like they're wearing like bandoliers of bullets. They're riding up and down the rivers and the coast with serious like PKM machine guns on a boat. Like, it was the maddest thing. That at the time when I was looking into it was like one of the main militias. What's the status of them now, and are they even like a main player?
Yeah, so the Niger Delta Avengers were kind of talked about in the same way, or to some extent, as kind of like, the MEND, which was this earlier manifestation in 2005, 2006, where the Avengers are kind of seen as like almost like the Avengers in the Marvel universe or whatever, where it's like if I'm remembering the movies correctly, and to be honest, I've never been a huge fan, but
I never seen them, man. I don't know.
yeah, right. That's fair enough. But I think like it kind of starts as like an ad hoc coalition, right? It's like different superheroes joining together, and then they become a team to fight the bad guys or whatever. I think it was kind of similar with the Niger Delta Avengers, where it was never like kind of a rigid kind of coherent insurgent movement where you had, the top commander and then his lieutenants and a very clear chain of command. It was more kind of, again, like an umbrella group. It's these movements, whether it's MEND or it was the Niger Delta Avengers, which was announced during the Buhari administration. They're kind of these groups are typically announced kind of to signal when there's kind of a general consensus of dissatisfaction among a lot of the key militant actors with the status quo one way or another. They kind of they'll announce these new movements to show a unified front, right? So part of it is kind of like a form of intimidation or signaling to the government, essentially that, hey, the government has almost used this approach of divide and rule, especially since 2009 with the amnesty and the contracts and stuff. And that's not been too difficult because, again, there's always been this competition between the different kind of social groups or the social elites in the Delta, and that includes the what they call the generals or the warlords down there of the different groups. So it's kind of from time to time the different groups will kind of band together to kind of send a signal to the state, which is like, hey, just because you think you're divided and that we're all happy just getting our little nibbling on the crumbs or whatever. Doesn't mean that you can rest easy, because actually if we team up and kind of almost like form a proper insurgency, right, then we're going to be able, we're going to do all these horrible things and threaten the Nigerian economy and to some extent the existence of the Nigerian state. So it's kind of like a way. I see groups like the Niger Delta Avengers. There was another one that was announced shortly before the elections this year in 2023 called the Force of Egbesu. They often Egbesu is this kind of like traditional spirit, kind of deity within the Ijaw people in the Delta, and so sometimes they'll often use these concepts and these kind of like the traditional religion, if you will, to kind of to mark their insurgency in a sense. And so like there was another force that was announced earlier this year, where again, it's not necessarily, it doesn't mean that all the different militant groups are now like banding together under one single commander. It's more, I think, a way of kind of signaling to the government that, hey, we can cooperate amongst ourselves when we need to, and that's a problem for you guys. So, you better come to the table and we need to renegotiate some terms.
What's the main tension there right now in the Niger Delta?
Yeah, so I think when there are a couple ways to look at it, right? Like, there's tension between the militant groups. There's kind of larger questions about, the Nigerian government, the new administration and stuff, and what policy they're going to take to the Delta. I think I'll kind of table that for now. I think one of the really interesting issues that I went to the Delta to investigate last year, and I think is still very much a relevant issue, is kind of this trade-off between oil bunkering and other forms of militancy or criminality. So to get back to what I was saying earlier, oil bunkering is a term that, that just refers to kind of stealing the oil right out of the pipelines, right? And that's been something that's been happening for decades in the Niger Delta. But in recent years, what's changed is that to some extent, both the local militants, but also a lot of kind of local community members have gotten a lot better at not just stealing the crude oil out of the pipeline and like selling it on the international black market, but also refining that oil themselves in these kind of like improvised, jerry-rigged kind of like refineries that they build deep in the creeks or the jungles or whatever. And some of them are like pretty big and impressive, right? And so this gets into a whole thing about how, there's no way you can hide some of these refineries from the authorities. So there's an element of corruption here where, certain bunkerers are paying off certain politicians or security officials and stuff to like be able to do their operation. But essentially, they've got these big refineries that they have in the jungle, and essentially they're taking the stolen crude oil and they're turning it into diesel, they're turning it into kerosene, they're turning it into gasoline, and then they're selling it either within Nigeria or on the regional markets to fill like a genuine demand from the consumers.
Who are they selling it to?
Well, that's the thing. I mean, they sell it. It's like, it's sold locally, so it very quickly actually gets mixed into the kind of the illicit supply chain, so to speak. So that's both within Nigeria, within the Delta, but then also like partially because up until this new president came into office, Nigeria had very heavily subsidized oil, and the new president's tried to remove that subsidy. So there's been a bit of back and forth. I won't get into that now. But because Nigeria has subsidized oil so heavily, what that means is that neighboring countries, like in the east, it's Cameroon, and the west, it's Benin. To the north, it's Niger. Even though those countries don't have fuel subsidies, what people will do is people from those countries will cross into Nigeria, buy Nigerian oil on the cheap, and then smuggle it out of Nigeria into their own countries. And then in effect, that like extends the subsidy because then they're able to sell that oil at a lower rate, within their own countries. So you have this like complex interplay where, between the fuel subsidy and just the rampant oil bunkering and stuff, there's actually like, it's very hard to tell how much of the oil within, at least when you're talking about like kerosene and diesel and stuff, that how much of that is actually like licit, as opposed to being produced locally or illegally. Because as I said, the Nigerian government doesn't have any functioning refineries at the moment. And so as a result, they're importing, refined gasoline and stuff. They import some kerosene, or actually, I think it's more diesel that they import, not as much kerosene. But anyways, the imported licit stuff gets very quickly mixed with the illegal stuff, and then even like the excess waste from the bunkering. When I was down in the Delta, they were saying that like some of the tar that they make from the bunkering can actually be used for local. It's used by like local mechanics and stuff because they can use it as lubricants in their engines, when they're fixing cars or whatever. That's not to say there's not a lot of waste. Actually, one of the big problems with bunkering is that it's really creates a mess environmentally because they do waste a lot of this kind of the excess the product that that comes out of it. But anyway, so yeah, I'll just say it gets mixed into the local market pretty quickly. There is an element, there's a transnational element as well, where you do have these big tankers that will come in and take, they'll just take the crude oil that's been siphoned off, by the militants or whoever, and they'll just they'll go out and import that, and that's a really big business, and that's one that has to have pretty significant collusion from at least mid-level officials, if not more senior ones, because essentially, and I interviewed people involved in that trade, and they talked about, we have guys in customs, guys in immigration, guys in the governor's office, all that stuff. They're all in on the cut. So essentially, the big tanker will come in, it'll dock at the main port, but then instead of taking the fuel directly from, say the Shell pipeline or whatever, it'll just take it from our guys. And then we'll give them papers, our guy in customs will give them papers saying that, this oil is licit, right? It's legit or whatever. And it takes like real investigations or efforts from the authorities to kind of stop all these tankers and look at the manifest and stuff and put two and two together and realize that actually, you're taking oil that, we don't have logged on our end as having been exported. So it's pretty high reaching, or far reaching, I should say, in terms of where it goes. But yeah, to get back to my original point, so this whole, this bunkering enterprise and artisanal refining, it's a real economic boon to some of the people involved in it. And that includes a lot of the militants, pretty much all the militants, and that includes some of the pirate gangs, the cultists, etc. They're all deep into bunkering. They're making money off of this and stuff. But also a lot of kind of, community members, right, who have turned to this because it's an easy way to make money. They see this, they see the oil in the pipelines as their own oil, right? That's the one thing that they said again and again when I was interviewing these bunkers. They say, this oil comes from our land. This is our land. We're the indigenous people of the Delta. So like, we're not stealing it. We're just taking from what's our own. I think one quote that I have in an article that I wrote on this from one bunker was like, we call it drinking from our own well, right? So they're taking the oil, and then in the absence of kind of better jobs and economic opportunities in the region and stuff, you have a lot of people. I mean, I've interviewed, single mothers, unemployed university graduates, like kind of a wide range of people who actually become involved in this bunkering enterprise. But I think in terms of that, your first question about like the tension, what's relevant is that the militants are getting pretty rich from bunkering. And they're doing that in collusion with different state actors and stuff. But so what that, kind of an interesting kind of corollary of that, if you will, is that the militants actually, in some cases, they're not engaged in as much of the violent activity as they used to be engaged in. They're not blowing up pipelines anymore because they're stealing the oil from it and making money off of it. In the case of like pirates, and I interviewed a couple of them when I was in the Delta, they're not engaged in as much of the high seas piracy, targeting international cargo vessels and kidnapping people for ransom, because that's a very high risk, high reward type of game, where there's a real chance you can get caught by the Nigerian Navy or other stuff, and so it's the payouts might not even be that great for some of the hostages. Whereas if you're involved in bunkering and you're just like paying off the local authorities, you can estimate, with pretty good confidence, I'm going to make this much money, over the course of a month, and these are going to be my expenses or whatever. So, one of the interesting things in the Delta, one analogy to think of it as kind of like a balloon, right? Where you squeeze in one area, but that air, it'll just go into the other side of the balloon, right? And then that side will inflate more. And I think that to some extent, that's been what's happening in recent years, where the government kind of touts both the amnesty program that it's doing, and then also its kind of security efforts. There's a very heavy Army and Navy and Air Force presence down in the Delta, obviously lots of police and other security agencies. And they'll say that, these are responsible for reducing the levels of violence, and particularly on these issues of like piracy. The Navy has engaged in a number of new initiatives and gotten new funding to do counter-piracy work. So they're very kind of, clear or eager to tout that. And I think that, that push factor, if you say, is there. Like some of the stuff with piracy, the pirates I interviewed did admit that, like, yeah, the Nigerian Navy's gotten better. They're a pain in the ass. We have to deal with them, all that stuff. But the problem is that, like, you're not actually stopping the militants from or the criminals from doing criminal stuff, right? They're just shifting their focus from a very violent form of criminal activity that's kind of high risk, high reward, to a slightly less violent form that's lower risk, still pretty high reward, but that is still, completely damaging the Nigerian state, right? Because Nigeria, to this day, they're struggling to meet their OPEC quotas. They're not producing, nearly as much oil as they aspire to be. This is having lots of ramifications for the budget, for inflation, for all this stuff. So it's kind of like there's almost this uneasy compromise there. And one thing, talking to the militants and the cultists and pirates, all that stuff, that was very clear in the Delta is that, they're aware of the leverage they have, right? And so what their view is kind of like, if the government comes in and tries to, mess with this bunkering operation, like, look, we've got a good thing going. We're not harming anyone by doing this bunkering, which is, of course, kind of a lie, because beyond the ecological damage, there's often actually violent turf wars between bunkerers over who controls which site and stuff. So I don't mean to suggest that bunkering is a victimless crime by any means, but the militants kind of, they can negotiate, if you will, with the government by being like, look, if you want to shut down our bunkering sites, we'll just go back to piracy, or we'll go up to blowing up the pipelines, right? And so you kind of have to let us have this thing, because this is something that, like, we're getting rich from it. Some of you guys are getting rich from it, right? Because we're all paying off, military officers and politicians. I mean, the politicians, this is something that also came through, are some of the, people deepest in bunkering down there, right? They finance a lot of the biggest sites. They use the funds from bunkering to finance their election campaigns and stuff. This is pretty well documented, going back to like the very start of the Fourth Republic, Nigeria's kind of resumption of democracy in 1999. So there are all these different actors involved. And I think that's what makes bunkering in particular a very thorny issue, because it's like a very delicate equilibrium. And if you take a policy that's, too much, goes too much in one direction, it's like that balloon analogy, right? You risk just kind of squeezing all the pressure into some other area, some other set of activities that could actually, be very destabilizing.
Popular Front is entirely grassroots and independent. Subscribe to our Patreon for hundreds of exclusive bonus episodes, extra video content, access to the Popular Front network, and much more. It keeps us moving forward and you get lots of exclusive content. Subscribe at patreon.com/popularfront. So you got this bunkering where they're essentially kind of, well, I guess you could say illegally, but it's they're taking the oil from the land without any kind of official permits or whatever, and then they're selling that on the black market. But whereabouts are the like big time oil companies now? Because I do remember reading years back that the Niger Delta Avengers, for example, had cost Shell Oil like millions and millions in oil theft and stealing from the wells and the pipes and stuff. What's the situation with that now? Of the oil companies, are they involved with this like illicit stuff? Are they involved with the government? Have they left? What's the deal?
Yeah, no, great question, and thanks for bringing that back in, because you can't discuss the Niger Delta as if it's just a Nigerian dynamic, right? The oil companies here are very, very heavily involved in everything that's happening. So essentially, on the question of bunkering, and I should add first that there's a lot of kind of anecdotal evidence of certain officials or employees of the company being involved in bunkering. That's not to say that the companies as a whole are, because it's hurting them, but you have that issue as well, where these militants and these bunkerers, they get rich enough, they can pay off officials within the oil company, and especially the lower level guys. So that actually helps them kind of engage in this practice. So I just want to make that clear, that kind of like, no one is innocent when it comes to this oil bunkering issue in the Delta. Kind of everyone's got a hand in it. But in terms of the company's, broader approaches. So yeah, essentially like during the height of the insurgency in the 2000s, and then again to some extent during the kind of the spike again in like 2015, 2016, more like 2017, yeah, as well, during the Niger Delta Avengers stuff. You had, serious periods of serious losses for the oil companies and stuff. And so that uncertainty, that threat of the insecurity, combined with the kind of reputational issues that a lot of these companies were having onshore, in terms of the grievances from the communities about the oil spills, the kind of a lot of the local politics and stuff, about where pipelines will pass through, which local communities get reimbursed for either damages from oil spills, or which local companies get contracts to provide pipeline security, all that stuff. It's been a real headache for the oil companies. And so a lot of them have started moving offshore. The international oil companies, at least, have started divesting from their onshore sites and selling them to Nigerian energy firms, to Nigerian companies, in favor of going offshore into kind of the deeper sea drilling and stuff. And, offshore drilling, it's more technology and capital intensive. So it's typically like it's not the low hanging fruit, right? Oil companies would prefer to go in and do the onshore stuff because that's, generally easier to extract. So you get a quicker return on your investment. So that's why a lot of the companies, traditionally in Nigeria were going onshore first. But it's gotten to the point where the kind of non-technical costs of maintaining a presence on shore. So that's, again, the security costs, the reputational costs, the political costs, all that stuff have gotten to the point where they outweigh a lot of the returns. And so a lot of the interest, and, there are other dynamics here, I think, to do more with kind of the global shift in how, or just kind of global shifts in like fossil fuel extraction and the oil industry that I'm probably, I need to refresh myself on that before talking more in depth. But I think within the Nigerian case, it's very much like a political and security issue, where because of those liabilities, they've decided to kind of do the more expensive stuff offshore, but at least there they have a bit more protection. And so this kind of creates or I should say it doesn't solve the issues, though, for a lot of the communities in the Delta, because if anything, and kind of what's been surprising is that, talking to a lot of these community members in the Niger Delta who have grievances against like Shell or BP, going back decades in many cases to, the very founding of Nigeria, or, to Nigeria's independence, these deep-seated grievances. Now that these international oil companies are leaving and they're seeing, who's coming in instead, which are these Nigerian companies, they're like, oh, no, actually, we miss the IOCs to some extent. That's the international oil companies, because a number of these Nigerian firms are just, they're kind of more transparently corrupt. They're even more negligent in how they kind of manage how they manage the pipelines and stuff. You have a lot of kind of like rumors, but it's kind of treated as like public knowledge in the Delta that like, some companies, like even the CEO of the company is involved in oil bunkering, right? So he's literally stealing from his own shareholders. And so you have just a kind of an even worse kind of a business climate in the area. And so, I did hear actually a lot of grievances from community members in the places I visited in two states down there. That just because the international oil companies have left, actually, the people that are coming in to fill the vacuum are not actually any better, and in some cases are worse.
Yeah, and from the research I've done on this situation in the past, I do remember, correct me if I'm wrong, like now, but I do remember back then Shell were not necessarily in trouble, but were suspected of having, middlemen doing work here and there to make sure they still got theirs.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very seedy business all around. Shell has gotten into trouble. There are a number of cases pending against them, and a London court has ruled against them in one notable case last year. So there's a lot of, that's actually one other thing that kind of started to shift in the 2000s, where you had local communities in the Delta who kind of realized that they were never going to get justice or kind of, reparations for the environmental damage and the kind of different corrupt and negligent practices that the IOCs have employed in the Delta. The communities realized they were never going to get that justice within the Nigerian justice system because the Nigerian state was too invested in the continued kind of exploitation of Nigerian oil by the IOCs. And so there was never going to be, they were never going to get a fair trial and stuff. So they started going into kind of international courts of arbitrage and stuff, places they'd go through like the OSCE system in The Hague, through courts in London. That's not an area. I'm not like an international law specialist. So I can't say too much there actually about the ramifications other than that. I think compared to a decade ago, the IOCs are also, and certainly compared to like 20 years ago, they're also more concerned about legal liability because some precedents have now been set that they can actually be held. They can be held liable for their actions in Nigeria, in an international court or in a court in a third party country. So I think that on the whole, all these factors have kind of contributed to a poorer investment climate. So yeah, it's largely the Nigerian companies that are coming in and buying off these blocks that are being auctioned off by the IOCs at like, pretty decent, pretty cut rates, because of all of those kind of investment challenges. One dynamic I think that could potentially change things quite a bit moving forward is they've now done some successful oil exploration in northern Nigeria. And there's a Chinese company, a parastatal, that's actually very involved in all of that. And so, there's been no serious kind of drilling or extraction so far, but the Nigerian government is kind of talking about that as, this is the next step in diversifying our, kind of our rents and our, our kind of revenues and stuff. And I think that could potentially have, very big impact moving forward. That combined with the IOCs kind of divesting from the onshore sites could potentially change dynamics in the Niger Delta quite a bit.
It's a weird situation. You got this like black market very much involved with one of the most profitable companies on earth. It's always been a really fascinating place to me, especially when you see the kind of like makeshift illegal refineries. What was it like going there? I know it's even to get to is pretty hard, right?
Yeah, I mean, like the Niger Delta is, there are flights within Nigeria, right? There are big cities. It's not, certainly getting to the capitals and stuff, it's not hard. These days, they do advise, foreigners to avoid traveling by road and certainly by creek, on the waterways, just because the rates of kidnapping and stuff are so high. So, when I was doing that, it was definitely, there are precautions we needed to take. I had to change my itinerary once or twice, in one instance, because one of the guys I was interviewing kind of overheard myself talking with a colleague about our travel plans for the next day. And the guy I was interviewing, despite, him being very friendly and us sharing a beer during our interview, was a cold-blooded killer and kidnapper, and very much, despite his pleasant smile that day, would not have hesitated to, lay an ambush the next day if he knew which road I was traveling on. So there was a lot of that, a lot of the logistics. I won't get into too much detail, but just, moving around different areas within a given city or within a state. Because especially, within the Delta as well, again, so many of these militants are rivals with each other. And so it's important that, if you're interviewing a guy from one gang, in the morning, and then you're interviewing a guy from another gang in the afternoon, you have to be kind of conscious about where you're conducting those interviews, both for your own safety, but also to make sure that, person A doesn't see person B from the rival gang and, accidentally, spark some sort of confrontation.
You could create a gang war by accident.
Yeah, exactly. And that's certainly not the goal. But yeah, I think one thing, and talking both to, local residents, but even to kind of other journalists, both Nigerian and foreigners who had kind of been, looking at the Niger Delta in the 2000s and stuff. I think one thing that one impression I get is that traveling by the creeks, which is how a lot of people, move around in the Delta, right? Because it's a very swampy area, very riverine. So a lot of communities are essentially cut off, by road. The only way to move is through motorboat. And it seems like, even at the kind of the height of the insurgency in the 2000s, it was actually like in some ways there was a bit more command and control between the insurgents, or at least the insurgents, the different gangs or militant outfits cooperated more. And so there was actually more predictability, and it was easier to travel by boat. And so both local residents, but even some foreign journalists, who I talked to would be like, yeah, actually, we moved from this part of the state to the other part on the boats. And like, so long as you informed the militants ahead of time, there was no problem. Whereas now I think that there's been much more fragmentation. There are more rival gangs, rival pirates, cultists, all that stuff. And so it makes, planning a trip by boat just like so much more unpredictable. And this is not just something that, I had in mind when I was, planning my own travel in the region, but something I also heard from local community members, which is just like, yeah, we're not able to take certain paths on the rivers these days because we know that at this point of the creek, one gang's territory ends, and then the other area, there's a zone of 5 kilometers or whatever, a stretch of 2 kilometers, and that's like where the pirates operate. And so you just don't want to go there because you don't know, what could happen. So it's definitely a volatile environment, and whether it's the oil bunkering or the kidnapping for ransom and stuff. It all has international ramifications and stuff, but, especially now that the oil companies and the NGOs and stuff, they don't typically keep their expatriate workers out in the city, out in the communities. Those guys live in well-guarded compounds in the capital and stuff. So it really is, it's the locals bearing the brunt, both of the ecological devastation, but also the insecurity. And I think that's a kind of unfortunate and tragic aspect of insecurity around Nigeria today.
This might sound naive, but why would they kidnap you? Is it because, like, for example, I don't know, let me say myself, if I was there and they kidnapped me, no one is paying a fucking ransom. Like, you know what I mean? Like, no one is going to pay a ransom for me. No one, no one has that money that I know. The government is not going to fucking do it. No one in England is going to be like, oh yeah, he's caught by this militia in the Niger Delta. What is it? Is it they think you're attached to something else, or is it just like a foreigner, just get any foreigner? I'm finding it's like confusing, because if they'll interview you but then also kidnap you, and trust me, I know I've done things like this where it's like, yeah, in any other setting you would kill me, but it's confusing. What is it they think they're going to get? Because surely they're already making a lot of money from the oil, and you're not exactly an oil exec,
Yeah. Well, for starters, don't sell yourself short, Jake. A lot of us are your admirers, and I'd pitch in a couple dollars. It's my Nigerian colleagues, even when I leave Lagos to go out into the field or whatever, they'll say like, I'm setting like a hard limit. I'm not donating more than like 2,000 naira to your rescue effort. And 2,000 naira is nothing, by the way. So I think in the Delta especially, it's and maybe that was one element I didn't cover in much detail earlier. But when the conflict was really escalating in the 2000s and into the early 2010s, the militants really targeted expatriate oil workers. With a very high kind of frequency and concentration. And that was both to send a signal politically, right? That like we can, it's no secret to anyone who's traveled around Africa that like international companies just treat their expatriate staff, much better than they treat local staff, right? Like expatriates are treated like special snowflakes, and the locals are just, it's assumed, yeah, you can deal with whatever crap comes your way because you're from the area. So, partially it's to send a political signal that we have grievances against these international oil companies, and so we're going to target the internationals. But they also very quickly realized that in a lot of cases, the oil companies would pay a hefty ransom. And very often it wasn't direct. I've talked to people who have been the middlemen in those negotiations or those hostage payments, right? So it's a very seedy business, and like you said earlier, there's kind of the whole element of middlemen there. But I think that definitely creates an impression among locals that or among the militants that foreigners pay. And you get that as well. I mean, you're seeing this in parts of northern Nigeria where they're targeting, Chinese and Indian and Lebanese construction workers in different areas. And these aren't guys who necessarily work for the big oil companies. But again, it's because, these people learn pretty quickly which communities pay ransoms and which don't. And of course, that's tough because, like, as we all know, in a lot of instances, like the militants can be wrong, right? Like some governments, even within, talking about like, Western governments and stuff, right? Like there are some governments that have a very strict line, like we do not negotiate with terrorists, and they really mean that. And there are other governments that say we do not negotiate with terrorists, and then they frequently negotiate with terrorists to pay ransoms to get their citizens out. But I think, it depends partially on like the sophistication of the militants or criminal group in question about whether they really distinguish between the different types of foreigners and distinguish between those who work for oil companies versus those who work for, like, say, NGOs, which, don't have the same types of money. And I think typically don't pay anything like what the oil companies pay. I think it's all very complex. And I think, there certainly are, militants and criminal groups in the Delta who would kind of make that calculation that actually adds not in our interest to kidnap one type of individual, whereas it is in our interest to kidnap another type. But as a general rule, you just kind of you don't want to roll the dice, right?
Yeah, I wouldn't want to take the risk. Yeah, just like I'll be okay. Next thing I'm dead. Yeah, no, definitely not.
You certainly don't want to take the militant's word for it, right? If they say, "Oh yeah, you can," it's that's the real risk, and sometimes you have to do that, but if you can avoid it.
It's such a fascinating region. Where is it headed, do you think? Where is all of this into, I don't want to say gang, but like militia violence is happening, but everybody's kind of getting paid. The piracy is even stopping. But like you just said, it's actually really dangerous and in some ways more volatile now. Where do you think this is all headed?
Yeah, it's tough, and I think that maybe it's, the best people to answer that would be like the kind of the historians and the scholars from the community who have the benefit of having seen how this conflict's evolved over 3 decades, right? Whereas I'm relatively new to it, and I can read the books about what it was like a few decades ago. But I think, to provide context, but to actually predict where it's going, I think it's very tough. In terms of like the more kind of near or immediate future, like there are these rumors going around that the new president is seriously considering maybe ending like the amnesty program and going into more of a, this kind of surveillance contract approach, right? Where essentially like expanding the pie, if you will, or like, baking a bigger cake for more people to cut into, which is kind of not dissimilar to how he actually governed when he was previously the governor of Lagos, which is the largest state in Nigeria. So one possibility is that like the Nigerian state kind of does away with some of the pretense, like the formal pretense of having an amnesty and all that stuff. And it really just does become like more of a business transaction. And that, it's kind of hard to say with certainty, like how that's going to play out. I think that there's a very high risk of a lot of increased violence, at least in the near term, where like, if you really do have a period where it's like, okay, the Nigerian state is now just going to like triple. And again, it's not just the state, right? It's all complicated because the oil companies, are supposed to, they don't necessarily pay directly for the surveillance contracts. Now it's mostly the NNPC, the Nigerian oil corporation, that does that. But the oil companies have a say in how all of this is kind of structured. So it's kind of a very multivariate situation. But there's a possibility that it's like, okay, yeah, the budget for paying off militants to guard pipelines is now increasing, twofold or threefold. And, depending on how that's divvied up and stuff, you could have a lot of militants like blowing up pipelines to say, okay, well, here we're signaling that, you have to take us seriously as part of these negotiations, right? Because that's just kind of criminal logic or warlord logic 101. It's happened in the Delta for years. It's happening in other parts of Nigeria now with other conflicts and stuff. So it's possible that you have that kind of violent bargaining. Maybe they do reach some sort of settlement eventually that actually kind of calms things down. But again, it's like, it's not going to be, there's the question of how sustainable is it, right? It's certainly not the definition of, quote unquote, good governance that, Western governments and NGOs love to preach about in Africa. But, without being too snide, it's also like a situation like that where you're literally just paying off the guys with the guns indefinitely. That does raise questions about like how sustainable is it, right? At what point do enough of the guys with the guns start thinking, well, actually, I've been happy for the past 5 years with the amount I'm getting, but now I want a raise and they're not listening to me. And so, I'm going to use these guns to cause problems and then I'm going to get a bigger raise so I think that I don't see kind of a real kind of comprehensive like solution to this problem on the horizon. The solution or the approach that's often touted, including by a lot of the kind of, I think, well-meaning and certainly well-informed like activists and stuff from within the Delta, is, their view is that, look, like you need to, in addition to kind of restructuring the oil economy a bit to really make sure that the funds from the federal government that are directed to the states are actually like, are really reaching the communities. And that's partially an issue of kind of corruption and making sure that the IOCs don't have loopholes to, avoid paying compensation to the communities and stuff. Like, in addition to all of that, the Nigerian government needs to build what are called modular refineries, right? Which are these essentially like kind of these, not like mobile, but these more ad hoc refineries that are theoretically cheaper to build than like the big typical, refineries that you think of that, you have in, say, like, in Texas or whatever, to actually like kind of refine, thousands of barrels of oil a day. These are, or hundreds of thousands. These are smaller refineries that have a smaller output. But the idea is that if you build enough of those in the Niger Delta, then a lot of the people who are engaged in artisanal refining and oil bunkering and all that stuff today could then have like a more like legitimate, licit way of earning an income. They could switch to like essentially doing what they're doing now, but in a way that's like regulated by the state and supported by the state. And so that reduces or removes the violent incentives of all this stuff, right? It's not too dissimilar to like, how a lot of advocates have said, in the past have said like, well, legalizing marijuana and other drugs will, turn Mexican marijuana and poppy farmers into more legitimate agrarians, and then that'll help reduce violence in Mexico. Unfortunately, to date in Mexico, it hasn't really worked that well because there are all these other confounding variables and complex factors. And in Nigeria, like this issue with the modular refineries, for example, there are just a ton of logistical challenges there. Nigeria, again, like it's kind of one of the mind-boggling things about the country, but despite producing so much oil, despite having such a large, very talented population and a very dynamic economy, Nigeria has like one of the worst power grids on the planet. Like not a day goes by when I'm in Lagos or Abuja where there's not a power outage. And so just like basic stuff like that, like, and so in some ways you kind of need to fix some of the basic problems with the Nigerian infrastructure and the Nigerian economy in order to be able to then like address some of these issues in the Delta in a more sustainable way. And so until that happens, I think we're kind of stuck in this limbo where it's kind of this violent bargaining or this kind of violent equilibrium, if you will, between the state and the non-state actors.
Yeah, and I think as well, what you were saying there about legitimizing it, it's only fair. oil was there, and then Shell and all these big companies moved in, and then the militias were like, hang on, no, that's our land, like we're gonna have it. To me, I'm kind of like, yeah, so what? It's like, yeah, of course they wanted to do that, and I don't know, I can understand that. If somebody came in my back garden and was like, yeah, sorry, we're gonna dig everything out of your garden and we're having it, I'd be like, no, you're fucking not. So I can kind of, like, it doesn't feel like ridiculous at all that they should then be able to get that. But I think then comes who that's not involved in the oil situation gets what, right? Like, not everybody in that region is a militant. Not everybody is in these makeshift oil wells. What are the normal average person gonna get in the Niger Delta?
Yeah, and that's, I mean, honestly, like, you're kind of really getting to I think the key, like the heart of one of the key problems in Nigeria, not just in the Niger Delta, but with all these other conflicts that you have in the country. Because honestly, like since the country transitioned to democracy in '99, it's just been like one fire after another. Like each part of the country is experiencing a different localized insurgency or communal conflict, some form of security crisis. And one of the problems is that, if you come in and you essentially, like, you have these, what are called these like non-kinetic solutions to trying to mitigate the violence there. And that often involves some sort of like disarmament and, demobilization and reintegration for the insurgents, which typically, like, it has to be supported by the state, which means that, like, the state is providing, or maybe the state via NGOs and the UN or whatever is like providing some sort of a livelihood support, jobs training, stuff like that, a stipend to these former insurgents. And so, but the problem is that people see that, right? People in the local community see that, and they say, well, that's not fair. You're rewarding, insurgency.
Right, where's ours?
You're rewarding the bad guys. And then outside that local community, right? So when it's happening in the Niger Delta, people in northern Nigeria will say, oh, you're rewarding the Southerners for being terrorists. And now that it's happening now, there's a similar program with Boko Haram, fighters of Boko Haram who surrender to the government and agree to undergo de-radicalization. So now that's happening in the north, and people in the south are saying, oh, the Nigerian government is, encouraging or incentivizing terrorists or whatever. And because Nigeria, and this would be a topic for many other recordings and stuff, but there's a very complex and fragile social fabric there, right? There's a long history of kind of mistrust or tension, kind of has ebbed and flowed over time, but between the different regions, between the different ethnic groups, between different religions and stuff in the country. And so when you have this kind of approach to, again, that non-kinetic approach, which I think in many instances is in fact the most effective, but the problem is that, like, it would be great if you could just do that in isolation, and just, take care of the former militants and, give them what they need to get back on their feet and to ensure that they're not going to become militants again, and like do it in secret from the rest of the communities so they don't see what's happening. And then everyone's just living together hunky dory. And then, to say nothing of the rest of the country. But that's not what happens, right? People see how militants are treated in one region when they surrender and they agree to a certain amnesty. And then that, it kind of influences public opinion, and maybe even to some extent, I mean, this is kind of an area of my ongoing research, maybe that also incentivizes the militants in other regions to think, oh, well, if we pick up guns, then then we'll get something out of the state or whatever.
Right, we might end up with legitimate oil jobs.
Yeah, exactly. So it's a very complex kind of it's a very complex situation. And again, I mean, like, there's no silver bullet. And I think that when you're dealing with these, the kind of the two bad options, right? It's like the lesser of two evils approaches. I think that very often, like, the non-kinetic approach, for all of its many flaws, I think does hold a bit more promise in some instances, just because, killing your way out of these insurgencies is incredibly tough. And I don't say that like as kind of some, principled pacifist or whatever. Like, I think that very often you need to tailor military operations with the non-kinetic approaches. But, like, I just struggle to think of, many insurgencies recently in Nigeria or elsewhere where, kind of there's been real sustainable success because it's like, oh, we just came in and killed all the bad guys.
Yeah, it never works. Right. It just makes more militant.
Exactly. That's not. And so it's kind of just a question of, again, I mean, to overuse that balloon analogy, it's like, yeah, I mean, maybe they buy stability in the Niger Delta for a bit, but like that, that kind of that negative energy, for lack of a better word, right? That kind of the capacity for violence or whatever is just kind of redirected somewhere else. And so, yeah, I mean, it's tough because you can't address you can't address the local issues without dealing with this kind of broader national issues of infrastructure and political economy and all that stuff, and even to an extent nation building, but also to focus just on these big lofty ideas of oh, we're going to make Nigeria into this great prosperous nation. If you're not paying attention to the particulars on the ground and stuff, and you're designing all of your policies in Abuja, in the capital or whatever, or worse yet, if you have the donors in Brussels and London and Washington designing the policies for you, which, a lot of African governments, I think, frankly, fall into that issue, then, it's not going to be attuned to the local realities, and that's going to cause its own set of problems. So,
sorry, I know I'm all over the place, but I'm just super interested in this whole region. I just remembered you were talking earlier a little bit about the cultists. Can you talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's never been a kind of a principal focus of my work. I'd love to kind of have the time to dig into this and look at the history and trajectory and stuff. But yeah, I mean, generally speaking, so these were groups that kind of formed as university confraternities in, particularly in the 1970s and 1980s, right? So Nigeria at the time of independence, they only had one college that was actually accredited as a full university, able to provide advanced degrees and stuff. So the 1960s and 70s saw the expansion of higher education in Nigeria, where the newly independent Nigerian state was actually establishing all these universities, because of course under British colonialism, the British hadn't really wanted too many Nigerians to be educated, so there weren't that many universities in the country. So as universities kind of spread in the 70s and 80s and stuff, they, at the same time that there was kind of a lot of Pan-Africanist sentiments and stuff going around the continent, and then also within Nigeria, a good bit of political turbulence, these kind of fraternities were founded by, typically young men, often with kind of invoking kind of aspects of traditional religion and stuff, and then also in kind of this ethos of Pan-Africanism and to some extent political activism. And so you had a lot of the big kind of infamous cults today were actually kind of formed as that, right? So they're not just fraternities in the sense that a lot of American university fraternities are essentially just glorified drinking clubs, right? They had a bit more of a political agenda, or at least a political leaning, though I think it varied from some fraternities to another. But then kind of as a result of the political tumults in the 70s and 80s into the 90s, and then I also think as a result of kind of the state of the public education declining with kind of structural adjustment and less funds going into the universities and stuff, a lot of these cults kind of became involved in local criminal activities. And then certainly when you had the transition to democracy in 1999, you had politicians, and this was mostly in southern Nigeria, more so than northern Nigeria, and even within the South, certain states and certain universities have reputations for being real hotbeds of cultism. But essentially, then you also had these politicians kind of using these young men who were typically underemployed. A lot of them would be coming from kind of the rural areas outside of the capital into the larger cities to study for university. So they wouldn't necessarily have kind of existing social networks in the city. So they would be very kind of, they joined these groups these fraternities because that's where they'd find their kind of kinship and their social safety net to some extent. But, when you had these fraternities kind of involved in local criminal activities, and then you had these politicians, what are often referred to as godfathers in Nigerian parlance, who are kind of these men who, if they're not running for office themselves, they're bankrolling their own guy to run for office so that he can then, be kind of be a client to the Godfather, and the Godfather can be pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Quite like Western democracy, actually.
Yeah, I mean that's a whole.
We just call it lobbying,
right? So there's so you have these kind of some of these cults getting drawn into more of the political side of things. So in a number of elections in Nigeria, and in some states, including in the Delta, and I heard this from the cultists themselves, that like, oh, election season, we're always excited about election season. It's really lucrative because like we're going to get, like essentially like we're going to get gigs from one politician or another, right? Depending on which cult you're in, it's like you have, that existing relationship with one political party or one politician. And essentially, we get paid by the politician to like, violently disrupt rallies, to, maybe throw some bricks or some fire bombs into the, through the windows of the rival political office, or maybe to even engage in like assassinations of political candidates and stuff. So yeah, and the other thing about these cults is that they've become kind of they've actually become very transnational, international in recent years, because as the kind of Nigerian diaspora has grown, with kind of larger waves of Nigerian migration, and especially, it's typically, certainly not always, but it's typically slightly better educated Nigerians, those with university degrees who are migrating abroad. And so a small number of them in whether it's going to the US or, places like Italy or the Netherlands or England have kind of been involved in these cults. And when they get to, when they get to Europe or when they get to the US or Southeast Asia or whatever, then they become like the consigliere, if you will, for that cult in that part of the world. And so they become engaged with, local, whether it's drug trafficking or internet scams, prostitution, human trafficking, all that stuff. So there's actually a very good BBC documentary about one particular cult called Black Axe. I'd recommend everyone watch it. And it's from BBC Africa Eye. A lot of it was actually filmed near the University of Lagos, and about, cults that have historically operated on that campus, which is where I've been based. And there, one of the interesting things about Black Axe is that like there was some Interpol operation a year or two ago where like essentially they rounded up 50 of these guys that were in countries from like Mexico to Malaysia to, Denmark to Russia and stuff. I mean, it's just often one or two guys, but they're all over the world, and so they're involved in some of these criminal activities. And that actually, I mean, beyond the individual harm that those cultists do when they're overseas, it actually creates tremendous headaches and real challenges for the the thousands of very well-meaning Nigerians who are trying to immigrate to those countries. And I speak from personal experience with, friends and my partner and stuff, like trying to deal with visa stuff where, in countries that have had issues with like the cultists or the internet scammers and stuff, it's just like there are all these other hoops you have to jump through to, prove that you're not going to engage in any sort of nasty activity while you're overseas. So it's, anyways, that's kind of a long, open-ended response, but I think the subject of cults should be you should reach out to another kind of expert on those and maybe kind of fill you in on that, because that's a fascinating topic in its own right.
Right, and they're not like, from what I'm understanding, then it's not like cults as in the way we might see them in the West. It's more of just a fraternity with that name. Like they're not doing rituals or anything like that, or they are. I don't know.
No, actually, most of them do. But I mean, it's the same thing. I mean, again, you're British, so you didn't have to go through the craziness of American fraternities.
No, it's really, really. You got they do. They like drown people and shit, right? Like kick the shit out of people.
Yeah, some of them aren't that bad, but certainly there are enough of them that have that like stereotypical. There are enough of them that kind of fit the bill to kind of perpetuate that stereotype. But like the American fraternities, right? They were also formed as secret societies, right? Same thing as like the Freemasons or whatever. I mean, like the Freemasons today, they still exist in the U.S. I'm not a Freemason, so I don't know, but I'm like pretty confident that they're not actually doing all this like crazy conspiratorial stuff that you might read about on the internet. I really think it's just like a social club for adults, but they still have these like, secret rituals and stuff. And same thing, like most fraternities, most guys just join because like, they want to drink and, hook up with girls and stuff. But there's still this element of like, the brotherhood and the secret rituals to enforce all of that. So like the Nigerian cults, like, especially like they really are doing like secret conspiratorial stuff now, right? Like most of them are actually involved in criminal violence and in criminal conspiracies, in some instances colluding with, working with like very senior Nigerian political figures. And so, like they really do take like oaths of secrecy and stuff very seriously. That's why something like the BBC Africa Eye documentary is notable, because it's not necessarily easy to get access to like these cult meetings or whatever. And when I've interviewed cultists, it's not been like in their secret shrine or whatever. It's been interviewing them one-on-one or whatever. So yeah, I mean, there's they do actually engage in a lot of these secret rituals. Some of them, are more kind of violent than others. It can sometimes be hard to know because there's so much like rumor, so it's hard to know like how much is sensationalized. Like, does this cult really actually like perform cannibalism as part of the initiation? Okay, maybe not. And then in other instances, it's like, oh no, like you actually have a detailed police report showing that these. So some of them are really, do some pretty bonkers stuff. So I don't mean to downplay that. I just think that their trajectory is interesting, from kind of emerging as more of like an activist movement into, more of a criminal underworld.
Mm. I just put in quickly in the Google about the cults, and there's this guy, Ateki Tom, King Ateki Tom. You know this guy, His Royal Majesty, yeah, and I'm looking at his Insta, and I mean, the royal family in England doesn't have this much like gold chairs and plates and stuff. This looks high end cult, definitely.
Yeah, well, and it's interesting you mentioned him, because he's actually one of the big players in the Niger Delta conflict as well. And so Ateka Tom he's a longstanding kind of cultist, or at least by allegation. I don't think he's ever fessed up to his, original cult ties. But he was actually someone who, like, when the Niger Delta conflict was kicking off, he formed what was called the Niger Delta Vigilantes. And so his like militia outfit, they claimed to be, providing protection to the local people from the militants, from the pirates and all that stuff. You talk to a lot of people from Okrika, from his area, they'll say actually they were engaged in all the criminal activities that they claimed to be fighting against. And they were also kind of co-opted by local politicians. And, so they kind of, they were very much part of that dynamic of like the gray zone of criminality. But Ateka Tom's interesting because like he positions himself as, one of the big militants, because the militants, at least in the Niger Delta, are kind of, they're talked about, I think it's probably safe to say like a decent portion of the population kind of sees the militants, even if they don't always agree with the tactics, they'll see the militants as like primarily being driven by grievance and like actually trying to address or like redress real wrongs and injustices. And the militants,
makes sense.
Yeah, and the militants themselves certainly position themselves that they won't say we're militants. They'll say we're freedom fighters, right? We're fighting for the Delta people. And so like Ateka Tom will position himself as like one of the militants, one of those like freedom fighters. But a lot of his kind of adversaries will say like, no, he's not a militant. Like he's a cultist. I was interviewing one, one set of militants for this, Niger Delta expose I did last year. And when I mentioned Ateka Tom in like the same breath as a bunch of other militants, and the guy cut me off and he's like, no, Ateka Tom's not a militant. He's a cultist, right? Like he's a step below us. He's a criminal. He never purported to fight for, for the actual like people of the Niger Delta. I mean, there's a lot, I haven't done like deep biographies on all these individual guys, so I'm not going to weigh in on the specific accusations or counter accusations, but it is interesting how the different labels kind of carry different connotations and carry different weight within the Delta and outside the Delta.
Yeah, no, it's so interesting. I want to meet Ateka Tom, man. This guy looks I love his crown and stuff, man. It's a mad situation out there. Is there any sign that the incoming government, whatever, is like particularly focused on this region?
To be honest, I don't think that this government or even the last government was particularly focused, just because, like I was saying earlier, even on the security front, which I don't think security is always or even usually actually a priority of the Nigerian political elite. I think that's one reason that Nigeria is the way it is today, is that there's a lot of negligence from the politicians. But even within the security arena, like Nigeria for the past 20 years, it's kind of just been like putting out one fire after another, or at least attempting to. And so right now, like, even though the Niger Delta conflict, because of that, because of it has the potential to be almost an existential crisis because of the oil and the ability of the militants to kind of threaten that. But kind of since 2009, like, to a large extent, like the government and, was able to kind of bring the conflict down to a lower boil, if you will. And I say the government, and again, there's like a lot of it was, the work had already been done for the government because there was already so much competition between the militants. But like essentially that strategy that the government employed of like the amnesty and the security contracts was a way to kind of like reduce the tensions a bit. And so, and that actually happened, like, the presidential amnesty program came into effect in 2009, which was the same year the Boko Haram conflict started. And by 2013, the Boko Haram conflict had just like escalated like crazy. Really by like 2011, things were getting really bad in the north with Boko Haram. And then, since I'd say 2018, 2019, or really since 2016, Boko Haram's been a bit more contained, though it's still very much a challenge in the northeast. And to some extent, there are cells elsewhere in the country. But just as Boko Haram's being contained, you have like banditry and farmer-herder conflict exploding in central and northwestern Nigeria. And then just in the past 2 years, you've had kind of a resurgent secessionist violence in the southeast. So just because of that, because of the kind of the constantly evolving and overlapping security challenges, the Niger Delta actually gets pretty easily forgotten. Because I think that the kind of thinking of the Nigerian government, the Nigerian political elite, whether it's this president, the former one, even the big opposition candidates and stuff, excuse me, the thinking is just like, well, look, no one's really solved this conflict, right? And, so long as we can just like keep things kind of at a low boil and kind of keep it under wraps, like I shouldn't let myself get too stressed about this issue because, frankly, they've been dealing with, kind of like agitations in the Niger Delta since Ibrahim Babangida was, military head of state in the early 90s, right? So like, I don't think any president kind of comes into office thinking that they're really going to like fix it overnight. I mean, maybe they do. The current president, Tinubu, who was inaugurated in May, his whole, like a big part of his agenda is to try to revamp the Nigerian economy and stuff. And part of that, at least on paper, involves modernizing the oil sector, but also, moving away from dependency on oil. But, every Nigerian president in the first year of their administration, or during the campaign, they have, they all kind of promise the same thing, right? They're going to revamp the oil sector. They're going to diversify the Nigerian economy. They're going to provide jobs for the youths. And yeah, they're going to handle insecurity and stuff. I think so far we haven't seen any kind of major moves in the Delta that point to kind of a real paradigm shift. But like I said, there's a possibility that maybe the current president will adopt more of a kind of business transactional approach. And so, yeah, I think we'll see what happens in the coming months.
All right, mate. I think a lot of our listeners will be really interested to follow your work that you did out there. Obviously, you went there, you were on the ground. Where can people do that? Where's the best place?
Yeah, thanks. I think I have the Twitter, mind virus like a lot of other people. So you can follow me there. I spend too much time on Twitter. My was it profile or username? Yeah, it's @JH_Barnett. And then also if you go to the website of the Hudson Institute, which is a think tank that I'm affiliated with in Washington, D.C., there you can also see in my profile, you can see a lot of my writing there.
All right, man. Thanks very much. That was really, really interesting.
Yeah. Thanks, Jake, for having me. It's a pleasure to be on.
That was the Popular Front podcast. If you want more exclusive bonus episodes, extra video content, access to the Popular Front network, subscribe to patreon.com/popularfront. We're entirely independent and grassroots. Nobody owns us. Patreon keeps us going, as does our merchandise. You can get Popular Front apparel and accessories at popularfront.shop. You can also buy our various publications there, like the Popular Front magazine. We're censored on social media and streaming platforms, so please follow us and share our content. Watch our documentaries at youtube.com/popularfront. Follow us on Instagram at popular.front, Twitter at popularfront_. And for uncensored updates on the world at war, follow our Telegram at popularxfront. If you want to keep track of my other work, it's the same on all socials at Jake_Hanrahan. That's HANRAHAN. You can find all these links and more at popularfront.cc. The music in this episode was produced by Sam Black. Check him out at samblackpf.com or search Sam Black PF on Spotify. The intro music though is by Home. Sound mix by Splicing Block. Thank you to the Patreons on the credit tier. They are Onofrio Modongno, Thomas Sadowski, Pengu, Jessica, Peter Cherry, Lupe Kodaranganika, Thomas Giuseppe, Jake Fuentes, Viola Forvel, Christian Bustamante, Daniel Verdin, Margosha, Rohan Irvin, Ryan Barbadillo, VS, Brian R, Justin, Evan Pank, Bradley Hope, Wizard Actual, Benjamin Topper, Chongus Bongwater, Siddhartha O, Damien, Cameron Collins, Scott Turnbull, Matthew Diffley, Claire, Liana, Robert, Sean, Kuzinar 8, Christianovich, NTHG, Ethan Schvick, Peter Nybratton, Gabriel K, AG Barcelona, David McManus, Tom Petrie, James Leons, Bradley Davies, No Dogs, No Hamsters, Brendan Crave, B, Dallas Dunn, LD50 Seattle, Adam H, B Rambo, Larson 8669, Ivan Julien, Diamondstein, Michael O'Connor, Nicholas Butter, JD, James Karpinski, Jav, James Cully, Ethan, Fitz Madrid, Ed Coulthard, D San, Mike Barone, Liam Williams, DZA, Giorgio Arani, Vegan Straight Edge, Amy R, Rubicon, Frank Austin, Amelia Me, Michael Neck, Freya Northman, Noah, Andrew Hurley, Vida Provost, Bike Lane Bowser, Brian McLaughlin, Tom Lochrin, Young Wasabi, Tony L, JL, Stephen Davila, Chad Walker, What Bitcoin Did with Peter McCormick, Christopher Martin, Ryan Sandercock, and Moritz Zumbul. Thank you all so much. Support Popular Front at patreon.com/popularfront.